Hello and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Chullin. Masechet Chullin deals with various issues of the kashrut of meat. There are four main foundations of the kashrut of meat. The first is the types of animals that are permitted for consumption, the animals that are tehorim. The obligation to slaughter a pure animal, a kosher animal. The third is the prohibition against eating a kosher animal that has become a trefa, an animal that was mortally injured. And the fourth is the prohibition of eating meat together with milk. And these are the main themes of Masechet Chullin. And in order to understand them better, we need to go back to the very beginning of the Torah, to the first chapter of Genesis. In Genesis, humans were originally forbidden to take life at all. The Torah says, "Hine natati lachem et kol esev zorea zera asher al pnei chol haaretz." I've given you every seed-bearing herb, and I've given you every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. And that's what will be your food. Lachem yeh leochla. And the Torah emphasizes not only will this be your food, people's food, every food that is comes from a seed-bearing herb or fruit or tree, but lechem yeh leochla ulechol chayat haaretz ulechol of hashamayim. So this will also be the food for you and for any animal who roams the land and for any bird in the sky. So the Torah here in Genesis is saying that the hierarchy is divided between all animals, including humans. They're all going to be in one category. And what divides that category from the rest of the world is that all animals and humans can eat anything that is made from a seed, anything that grows from the earth. So it seems that that was the original vision of the Torah. However, over the next few chapters of Genesis, we hear how humanity deteriorated and became corrupt until eventually God had to bring the flood and start the world over again. And in chapter 9 of Genesis, we hear of God giving new instructions to Noach and to humanity. And many of them are very similar to what we heard in chapter 1, for instance, Pru Urvu, right? The commandment to procreate. But God also says that some things will be different from now on. And only after the flood was the consumption of meat permitted. God says, "U'merachem v'chitchem yeh al kol chayat haaretz ve'al kol of hashamayim." So from now on, the fear and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every fowl of the sky. Be'yadchem nitanu, into your hand they are given. So here, for the first time, the Torah is restructuring the hierarchy, and it's saying, no, it's not that all living things are in one category compared to everything that grows from the earth. Now we have a three-part hierarchy. We have humanity, we have animals and birds and all other living things, and only under that we have everything that grows from the ground. And the Torah goes on to emphasize that to explore the dynamics between these categories in the hierarchy, because it says that if if an animal kills a human, then God will demand the blood of that human from the animal. However, people are allowed to eat animals. And the Torah ends by saying, "V'shofech dam adam ba'adam demo yishafech ki b'tzelem Elohim asa et ha'adam." Right? Even amongst human, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. He will have to pay the price. And all of this is summed up with the principle, Ki b'tselem Elohim asa et ha'adam, for in the image of God he made man. So that principle is explaining this new hierarchy that is developing in the wake of the flood. Because humans are made in the image of God, they are distinct from all other living things, and therefore they and only they can eat other can eat other living things. However, in order to preserve the principle embedded in the original moral command of Genesis 1 of the creation story, the Torah later says that a person is forbidden to benefit from meat unless he takes that life with his own hands. So when a person is satisfying his desire to eat meat, it's not just like plucking a fruit from the tree. It's a completely different experience. A person has to stand face to face with the creature who was originally commanded, just like him, to eat the grasses of the field. And the person has to know that only because he was created as Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, only for that reason is he superior to that of animals. And that is the only reason that permits him to take the animal's life. And I think that this is a very important for us, important point for us to note as we start Masechet Cholin, because in the modern period, in the last, I don't know exactly, but I assume around 50 years, there's been a huge shift in how we treat the food that we eat. In the past, people would live with their animals, sometimes in the same home or in their or on their farm or in the vicinity of their village or of their city, and they saw these animals all the time. Today, we mostly buy our meat and our chicken in a supermarket, and we don't really have any sense of all the varied ways that there are of killing birds and animals in mass production in order to supply meat for humans. And so there's something very profound in the requirement that in order to turn an animal into food, a person has to stand face to face with a living creature, with a knife in his hand, and to cut the signs of the animal's life, the trachea and the esophagus. And I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly. The trachea and the esophagus are the locus of life because they're in the neck. And the Torah sees the neck as the place from where the nefesh leaves the body. And sometimes, even throughout the Torah and in the other books of the Tanakh, the neck is actually called nefesh. For example, in the expression "Hegiu maim ad nafesh," the water has reached the neck or the soul, as it's often translated. So the trachea and the esophagus are the essential signs, the essential simanim for the commandment of slaughter, of shchita. And there are certain differences that we'll see between birds and between animals, but in principle, both of these involve these simanim. This central principle of confronting the taking of life head on, literally, is reflected in five very important principles, or one could say five errors that a person can make, that the shochet can make during slaughter. And each of these errors will invalidate the slaughter and render the meat trefa. So the first one is shehiyah, which means stopping or pausing during the act of slaughter. The second one is drasa, which means pressing down on the neck instead of using a back and forth cutting motion. The third is chalada, which means slaughtering in a way that the knife isn't visible. So, for instance, that the knife is covered by the skin or by the fur of the animal. The fourth is hagrama, which means that there's a certain section of the trachea and the esophagus that need to be cut. And if you slaughter above or below that section, that renders the meat pasul. And the fifth error is ikur, which means tearing the trachea or the esophagus. So all of these principles have in common the idea that the animal shouldn't die from blood loss or shouldn't die in a degrading manner during the slaughter. And again, each of these errors is a way of forcing the slaughterer to be very, very precise, very, very exact in the slaughtering, and not to create a situation where a person can just somehow harm or damage the animal and then let it bleed to death, but not come face to face with the fact that, yes, it is I, the slaughterer, who is now taking the life of this animal. So these halachot force the slaughterer to stand face to face with the fact that I, in one swift cut, am taking the life of another living being. Similarly, the halacha of trefa also demonstrates the same principle, because we said the halacha of trefa, a trefa is an animal that's already dying, an animal that was mortally injured. So, for example, if one animal, pounced on another animal and bit it, and it's clear now that that animal is going to die, or if the animal has internal bleeding, okay, so eventually this animal will die. And as we know, meat is very expensive, and in the ancient world, even more so, precisely because of what I mentioned, that there was no mass production. And so an owner of an animal might be tempted when they see an animal that's already dying to quickly shech that animal so that they don't lose the meat. The fact that the halacha says no, you cannot do that, again demonstrates this principle that the person performing the slaughter has to be fully conscious and responsible for taking a life. It can't be a life that is being taken by an external circumstance. I want to relate this also to the fact that many of the halachot of the slaughtering of chulin, non-sacred animals, are similar to the halachot of kodashim, of sacred offerings, where every blemish can undermine the wholeness of the sacrifice and invalidate it. And a second point is that we've seen in Masechet Zvachim that an essential condition of a sacrifice is the proper reception of the lifeblood from a correctly performed slaughter. So that the blood, which the Torah says, ki hadam hu hanefesh, the Torah is the life, the blood has to be brought to the altar and thrown upon the altar in order to atone for the sins of the owner of the korban. And similarly, in the slaughter of chulin, in the slaughter of profane or non-sacred animals, one of the important laws that we'll see discussed throughout a full chapter is the covering of the blood, the covering of the lifeblood, and treating it with special respect. So these are just two examples from many, many similarities and juxtapositions that we'll see between the shechita of chulin, of non-sacred animals, and the shechita of kodashim, of sacred animals. And this list leads us to an important point. The laws of chulin, which means non-sacred, are located in the order of kodashim, of sacred things. So this seems very, very strange because seemingly, chulin is exactly the opposite of kodashim. Generally, kodashim deals with anything that's related to the temple, sacrifices, and anything else that has to do with the Mikdash. Tractate Chullin, by contrast, focuses on laws that are related to meat, but meat that specifically has nothing to do with the temple. It's the meat that I eat at my own table. And I want to point out this decision by the editor of the Mishnah to place Chulin in Seder Kodashim. I think that this is a very intentional decision. By placing Chulin alongside sacrificial laws, the Mishnah and then the Talmud is creating a comparison between ordinary everyday eating and between achila legavoa, between divine consumption in the temple. And it's making the idea that even daily eating should resemble what occurs in the Mikdash. My table at home is not the same thing as the altar, as the Mizbech in the Mikdash, but I need to treat the preparation of this food in a way that is analogous in some way to how sacrificial meat would be prepared. And indeed, we can see that in the past, chulin, which today is, generally when you say chulin in a yeshiva, then most of what's focused on is the halachot of basar b'chalav, for example, things that we see in regular, everyday, modern kitchens. But the centrality of shchita in the past was really the central part of this Masechet. And even though the way that the Mishnah is organized today, which we know is organized according to the length of the Masechet within the order. So Zvachim has 14 chapters, Menachot has 13 chapters, Chulin has 12 chapters. But in the past, Chulin was seen as a continuation of Zvachim because they both deal with slaughter. And therefore, in the Tosefta and in some Gniza fragments of the Talmud Bavli, Chulin appears after Zvachim and before Menachot. And actually, in the Middle Ages, Masechet Zvachim was called Shchitat Kodashim, and Masechet Chulin was called Shchitat Chulin. So we see that the rabbis understood them to be really connected and intertwined. Let's talk about the structure of this Masechet. The first two chapters address the basic ideas of slaughtering. So who can slaughter? What are the tools that are used for slaughtering? What is the exact method of slaughtering? What invalidates slaughtering? And significantly, what is the intention that is required for slaughtering? Which again leads us back to Zvachim, where we saw that intent was a huge part of that Masechet. Chapter 3 deals with what renders an animal fit or unfit for slaughter. It discusses the trefa, an animal who cannot be slaughtered. And it also discusses which are the animals that are kosher. Domesticated animals, wild animals, birds, locusts, a whole list of animals that we need to understand exactly what are the simanim, what are the signs that determine whether they're kosher. Chapter 4 addresses a very specific case. What if an animal was slaughtered and after it was opened up, in the womb was found a fetus? What is the status of this fetus? Should it be slaughtered separately, or is it considered already slaughtered because the mother was slaughtered? This connects also to chapter 5, which has to do with the prohibition of otoved bno, the prohibition of slaughtering an animal and its offspring on the same day. So chapters 4 and 5 are connected in the sense of the parent-child, parent-offspring relationship. Chapter 6 is the final chapter that deals directly with slaughter, and it focuses on kisui adam, uncovering the blood. And then the remainder of the tractate doesn't deal with shchita, with slaughter, but it deals with other aspects of the consumption of meat. So chapter 7 deals with the prohibition of eating gid hanashe, the sciatic nerve. Chapter 8 deals with mixtures of meat and milk, or kosher and non-kosher. Chapter 9 deals with the laws of food impurity. Chapter 10 deals with the portions of meat that are given to the priest before one can eat one's own meat. And chapter 11 continues this theme of the priestly gifts and deals with Reshit Hagez, the first shearing, which is also a priestly gift. And chapter 12 deals with returns to the theme, I guess, of the mother and the baby. It deals with the commandment of shiluach haken, of sending away the mother bird before eating the baby birds. So it's related to how one acquires the birds that one is going to slaughter. So in summary, about half the tractate deals directly with shchita, with slaughter, which is required to render the meat of a kosher animal fit for consumption. And the second half of the tractate deals with various specific issues that are related to kashrut and to meat consumption. I want to conclude by saying that the comparison between everyday eating, chulin, and sacred consumption, kodashim, is actually a way of sanctifying ordinary eating. And this approach stands between two extremes, between hedonism and aestheticism. A culture that is hedonistic sanctifies the body and sanctifies consumption, sanctifies eating, sanctifies sexuality. Okay, so it puts all the functions of the body as central to the culture. On the other hand, a culture that is ascetic will focus on withdrawal from the body, withdrawal from eating, withdrawal from sexuality, and denial of the body. So the former sanctifies the body, and the latter sanctifies the soul and denies the body. Masechet Chulin is seeking a middle path. It's recognizing that the human being is both body and soul. The person has physical needs, but humans are unique in the fact they're unique from all other living things in their capacity to endow the physical acts with meaning and with sanctity. Halakha acknowledges the need to slaughter and to eat animals, but it demands that we'll relate to this act in a way that is similar to how we relate to what we do in the Mikdash. That this slaughter won't just be something that we do for our base physical needs, but something that will be approached with awe, with care, and that will elevate and sanctify the very human act of eating. Thank you. Good luck in learning the Masechet.